Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is Jonathan Schell. He is a distinguished and prolific author and professor. His work has appeared in The Nation, Harper's Magazine, The Atlantic, and other publications. His many previous books include The Fate of the Earth and The Unconquerable World. His latest book is The Seventh Decade, The New Shape of Nuclear Danger, and he's here to discuss it with us today. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Thank you. It's interesting because you point out that we're in our seventh decade of nuclear technology, and in a time where I think a lot of people are, believing that the nuclear threat is fading. You're arguing that in fact it's the reverse.
Yes, in fact, I think the nuclear age is really coming into its own for the first time. It's reaching its prime, so to speak.
Right.
Back in 1945, the nuclear scientists knew and said that this technology was destined, like all technology, like a television set or anything, to be available to all and sundry. Eventually, every nation would be able to do it, and even groups that were not nations. But it's a difficult technology, so it's taken 7 decades for us to reach that point. Mm-hmm. So it was a great mistake to identify nuclear danger with the Cold War. I like to say that in that period, this danger took on a two-power disguise.
Okay.
But that was really not the inner nature of the thing. The inner nature of the thing was to be coming at you from all points of the compass, because you simply cannot confine the spread of scientific knowledge and technical knowledge. Right. So that's where we are now. So only now, really, for the first time in the nuclear age, do we face it in its true and destined form, so to speak.
Now, how difficult is it to convey that message to academics, politicians, citizens? Because, again, it seems, I get the impression from your book that obviously this is not a widely understood reality, that people don't really appreciate the real danger that we're in.
Well, that's absolutely true. And what happened was that at the end of the Cold War, that identification of the nuclear danger with the Cold War was so strong that people thought that when the Cold War ended, nuclear danger had ended too.
Yeah.
And they really forgot about it. Politicians forgot about it, the press forgot about it, universities, foundations, the public, you name it.
Right.
And so we have a whole new generation that grew up without having been told the ABCs of this issue. Mm-hmm. So now that we see that far from having gone away, it's metastasized, mm-hmm. It comes as a great surprise. And people don't understand that the different elements that we see popping up in North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, but also in the United States and in American policy, even, and this is really not noticed, but it's very important, what's happening in England and France, because they're rejuvenating their nuclear arsenals and retargeting them and renewing them. In England, they're about to spend 20 billion pounds to renew the Trident system, which is their platform for firing off nuclear-armed missiles.
The submarine?
The submarine, the Trident submarine, and its associated missiles. So it's like a puzzle with 500 parts, and you have to look at them all together to understand what's going on now. And at the same time, and it's the reason I call this book The Seventh Decade, mm-hmm. you have to go back to the beginning of the nuclear age, and you have to see how it's developed from then until now. So you need to step back from the whole thing and see, where is this story, which is a single story? Where are we now in that story, and where is it heading?
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because again, if you look at Russia, if you look at the U.S., I think you mentioned as well that they're modernizing, and that there's something like maybe 27,000 nuclear warheads worldwide.
Yes.
So again, the threat is massive. And you also mentioned that there's this kind of idea of almost a limited strike, that this idea that if there were rogue states, if something did happen, that there seems to be an impression that's forming that somehow that you could use nuclear weapons in a limited way. And that's a very new idea.
Well, that is a new idea. I mean, it has some roots back in Cold War policy. Everything's connected to everything else. But what is really new, and we see this in American policy, but also, let's say, in French policy, mm-hmm. Is the idea that nuclear weapons, nuclear arsenals, are a fit instrument for attacking the facilities of proliferators or would-be proliferators. So, but this is where the whole thing gets very, very confusing and sort of madly out of control, if you will. Because once again, if you go back to the end of the Cold War, which was such a key moment, sort of a moment of inaction that was as important as anything that anyone ever did.
Right, because you had said that it was a great opportunity that was missed.
It was a tremendous opportunity that was missed, and now we're paying the price. And it set the stage for what we see today, because what happened was that the Cold War powers sort of tacitly and without saying anything about it coasted on with their nuclear arsenals, kept them, did not radically reduce, or not to speak of eliminating them, as I think they should have done. And that set the tone for India and Pakistan and other proliferators, but nobody really fastened on or examined that connection back at the time. But now we see what happened.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because if you look at the post-9/11 world, you describe the change in attitude of the U.S., and I'm wondering if you can kind of identify what has, essentially the post-9/11 period done to the idea of nuclear proliferation and just the spread of these to other countries.
Well, let me take one key aspect of it, and that was a true revolution in American policy. Now, everybody knows that there was a revolution in American foreign policy after 9/11.
Right.
But what's not fully appreciated or is somehow only partially seen or not put together in its entirety is the fact that there was a revolution in the nuclear policies of the United States.
Okay.
And really, that came in two parts. One was to abandon the tradition, which was as long as the nuclear age to that date, of opposing proliferation by diplomatic means, peaceful and diplomatic means, which gave birth to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has 183 signatories, a great triumph, really, of diplomacy. Probably the most important treaty that was ever negotiated in history, in my humble opinion.
Right, okay.
But to turn from that, to jettison that tradition, in effect, and to turn to the idea that the solution to proliferation was military force. And that's what the Iraq War was about.
Right.
If there's a war with Iran, God forbid, that's what it will be about. And now you'll see on the op-ed page of the New York Times, Michael O'Hanlon and, is it Fred Kagan? I don't want to get it wrong.
Okay, yeah.
Proposing that the United States might have to intervene in Pakistan to take
goodness.
control of their nuclear arsenal. So there it is, right in the New York Times, a whole new country.
Right.
So that was a radical shift. The second part of it was that the retargeting of American forces consistent with that new policy, because after the Cold War, the government, the administration faced the question, well, what do we have these for? There's no point in targeting them at Russia, although in fact we do.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's that all about, for number one? But sort of groping for new justifications for having nuclear weapons in perpetuity, they hit upon the counter-proliferation mission. And so there's something called the Global Strike Command that was set up in the Pentagon that enables the United States to hit any point on Earth with a conventional or a nuclear weapon, really at a moment's notice, sort of a hair trigger capability for the whole Earth. So the new target was really the whole Earth. So these two elements are part of a tremendous transformation that really happened under the radar.
Now, it's interesting. Are you arguing as well, though, that the proliferation that we're seeing in countries like North Korea and countries like that is being caused because of that perceived threat that they have because of global strike?
I would say it was certainly goaded by that. It's not the sole reason. I mean, I think proliferation has a momentum all its own, but it's as if we poured kerosene on the fire.
Okay.
And when the North Koreans, to give you just one example, saw what we were about to do to Iraq, they thought to themselves, we better watch out. And a North Korean general actually told an American journalist, we see what's about to happen in Iraq. This is in 2002, and you're not going to do it to us.
Right.
And so they went ahead and got a nuclear weapon.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned that essentially if you take the two major human-caused catastrophes, nuclear proliferation and global warming, They have some things in common, but there's certainly some key differences. Do you argue that that one is perhaps more urgent than another?
No, no, I wouldn't say that. I
Yeah.
think it would be a mistake to enter into some kind of rivalry with global warming as a
Okay.
horror.
Yeah.
The way it looks to me is that global warming has created a new context in which to see the nuclear danger. I've always believed, and I've written, that the nuclear danger was the first of the great ecological dangers, because it was not only humanity that was threatened with extinction,
But the
it was
planet.
plants and animals, and I called a chapter of my book, The Fate of the Earth, a republic of insects and grass, because that's what's left.
Yeah.
After. So that's an ecological danger. So really, what I think we need to do is to focus our attention on the whole array of dangers of a new order of magnitude which threaten the natural foundations of life. And those include global warming, the extinction of species by all kinds of other means,
Right.
and right at the top of the list, or right in there with all the rest of them, the nuclear question. So it's a new moment in a much broader sense. There's a new context. So I just hope that all those people who got out back in the 1980s to demonstrate for the freeze would wake up again.
Right.
Realize this is back in a big way, but in a new context, in a new moment, but it must be addressed, and we have to take very radical action, and I would say much sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and do you think that because of the global consciousness that would be required to solve something like global warming, does that make you somewhat more optimistic that nuclear proliferation in turn, which would require such cooperation around the world, could be solved in a better way because, hopefully we're entering a new paradigm where that could be the case?
Yes, I absolutely think so. And in
Yeah.
a certain sense, I see, this is perhaps a foolish thing to say, but compared to global warming and the other ecological threats and global threats, getting rid of nuclear weapons, which is what I think must be done, it's too late to nibble around the edges for partial solutions. We're in the 7th decade. We have to grasp it. But I see getting rid of nuclear weapons really as a sort of throat clearing for addressing the towering agenda of other business that's been placed on our plate on a global basis, and includes, of course, global warming, economic issues, north-south issues, epidemics,
Right.
this whole array of issues of a new order of threat that we're facing. So it's the easy one, so to speak. But right now people aren't thinking about it, although I think they're just beginning to. I see a revival of interest and thought.
Okay, because it's interesting you talk about sort of an ebb and flow of sort of nuclear proliferation consciousness since 1945. So your argument essentially is that we're kind of on the upswing, but it's gradual, that people are more conscious, but they're not conscious enough.
Well, look, we've had one crazy war
Right.
in the name of counter-proliferation. That's the wrong approach. That's a comprehensively wrong approach. We're threatened with another war against Iran, not to speak of Pakistan, as we were
Sure.
saying before.
Right. Yeah.
So this issue is actually front and center in just about every foreign crisis that you care to mention. Look at Russia and the United States now, quarreling again over the U.S. desire to place defensive missiles in the Czech Republic and Poland.
Right.
And Putin has started to tear up the old Cold War arms control agreements, to threaten to withdraw from those, and actually to suspend cooperation in Europe. So this stuff is there. The world is turning around it, so to speak, but we haven't quite identified that central matter that is really sort of organizing our affairs without our noticing it.
Right, the elephant in the room, so to speak.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and when you look at structures like the UN that have been so criticized in the last 10, 20 years because of, slow reactions to genocide and these kinds of things, is there any recommendation that you would have in terms of an adaptability of international organizations to show some leadership on this issue?
Well, the way I see international organizations is they have no constituency in the sense of people voting for them, and of course, really, they are assemblies of the nations of the world. So if the nations withdraw their support, then they are weak.
Right.
If they give their support, if they give the money, if they act in those forums and show respect for their decisions, then the United Nations and other international organizations are strong. So I'm not one who bashes or blames the United Nations.
Okay.
Kofi Annan, went around with his hat in his hand for years trying to do something about Darfur, let's say, but the money wasn't forthcoming. The troops were not forthcoming. So these are national decisions, and only then do international organizations become strong and capable of dealing with these issues, which must be dealt with. There's no choice. It's a no-brainer. Either you deal with them on a global basis, or they are not dealt with.
Right.
Simply.
Yeah.
So there's no choice in the matter. And for that you need international organizations, obviously, whatever they would be. Well, the UN is the one that it has to be, because that's what we've got. And there can be others arrayed around it, but the UN has to be at the center.
Yeah, and it's, I remember from the book that you had mentioned that the U.S. president that had done the most to counter proliferation, interestingly enough, was a Republican. It was Ronald Reagan. And how, if you look at Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, they recently called for the total ban of all nuclear weapons. It's interesting because when you look at some of these, these people that in the past, people weren't necessarily sure what their position was. They're coming out now and they're saying, as you're saying, that this is the time, it's got to happen now. Yeah.
Well, it's not widely appreciated, but one of the more astonishing episodes of the nuclear age was the Reykjavik summit of 1986.
Yeah.
When Gorbachev and Reagan met and came very, very close to an agreement to abolish nuclear weapons. In fact, there's a wonderful moment there when Reagan says, "Does this mean we will get rid of all nuclear weapons? Because that's what I'd like to do." And he did want that. And Gorbachev says, yes, it does. And at that point, George Shultz, who was in the room in Reykjavik in Iceland, and he burst out, very normally a sort of impassive fellow.
Right.
He burst out, "Let's do it." Well, it didn't happen. But
I was just going to ask, do you know what it was that prevented it? Was it one person or one side?
Well, it was two things, really. There were people involved because people were doing it. But the issue that it broke down over was the Strategic Defense Initiative, otherwise known as Star Wars, which Reagan was deeply committed to. Right. And Gorbachev couldn't tolerate. The irony of it is that couldn't exist. It was a technical fantasy, so no point really in Reagan championing or in Gorbachev resisting it, because it was a phantom.
It's a theory, yeah.
It was a theory, and it was a phantom. That's a very complicated subject, but that's how the summit broke down. But the fact that a Ronald Reagan, who was as right-wing a president as the United States had until the current administration, that he could develop this really moral disgust at nuclear weapons. It was a very visceral and passionate thing for him. Right in the midst of the collection of Superhawks around him is something that renews some of my faith in our common humanity, because it overleaps divisions of left and right, Democrat and Republican. Yeah. So I place a high value on that.
And it's one of those things, like you're saying, it is a moral issue. And so when you look at 2008, you look at all the political changes that are happening in the U.S. and nobody knows necessarily where that's going to go. This is a very chaotic time, but it could be a time of great opportunity. And do you get the sense that there could be enough consciousness that this could be thought of as a moral issue, a bipartisan issue, and therefore, to give it the kind of credibility and importance that it needs, because it is, as you say, such a complicated issue that to solve it requires great political will.
Yes, I do think that we are potentially at such a moment. We certainly are at such a moment in the sense that the existing policy, born after September 11th, that we were discussing, of trying to stop proliferation by force, is clearly bankrupt. Oh, you have to look at Iraq, look at the possibilities in Iran, very poor. Look at what's happening in Pakistan, North Korea, and all the rest. Okay. This is a failed policy. So there's a policy vacuum on a huge scale, and it goes beyond the nuclear question. It has to do with the whole sort of imperial approach of trying to run the world with military force, which is just not only wrong but completely unworkable. And it didn't work. It's failed. It's a flop.
Sure.
So there's a vacuum, and politics abhors a vacuum just as nature does.
That's right.
So if we have people who are bold enough to step into it, one thing in my book that I give Bush some credit, because I say at least he was bold. At least he knew there was a terrible problem and something bold had to be done.
Okay. Yeah.
And persisted in it.
Okay.
Heaven knows, he persisted.
That's true.
Well, it was 180 degrees the wrong policy. But the boldness part is something that could serve as a model for some Democrat. Barack Obama says that the audacity of hope.
That's right.
And he's shown a little bit of audacity here and there, but a little bit of audacity, I'm not sure it is audacity. I think you have to have a lot for it to be audacity.
Yeah.
Maybe he could step forward. And he has actually called for the elimination of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I was just going to say, is there any candidate on either side that has? So Barack has done that. Is there anyone else that has?
Yes,
addressed
John
it?
Edwards has done it, and Bill Richardson has done it, and of course, who's done it from the very start and persistently, and before there was any Henry Kissinger calling for it, was Dennis Kucinich.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So I give him great credit for that, and he's persisted in it, and he's fought for it. So it's much to his credit.
Is there anybody on the other side of the aisle that has?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
And this is really almost comical, because all 8, or 10, 12, 15 Republicans, whatever the number is on that side, I think it's 8.
Yeah.
They're knocking one another over, trying to claim that they are the heirs of Ronald Reagan.
Oh, interesting.
But none of them has taken him up on this matter of supreme importance.
Okay, that's interesting. And also, of course, they're trying to distance themselves from Bush.
And they're trying to distance themselves from Bush and embrace Ronald Reagan, but without actually embracing what was absolutely a key policy of his presidency, which was his really passionate dedication to getting rid of nuclear weapons. It wasn't just a brief flirtation with the idea. It was a persistent goal of his. I mean, that's company I'm not normally in, quite frankly. Okay. And if you would go over 8 or 9 other policies of Reagan, I'd have a lot to say against that presidency.
Sure.
But once again, I'm very heartened. It's as if to say that when we're faced with something that really threatens the human substance, that really touches on the essence of our existence, that it's possible to cut across political lines and make common cause.
And you must, it seems to me.
And you must. We won't solve it unless we do that. So there's an additional value, a necessity, really.
It's an interesting thing because, again, this is such a complicated time in the world. This is a time of, certain kinds of chaos, but also great opportunity. And it seems that some of the most complex and difficult issues perhaps might have something to teach all of us, that we have to maybe go beyond perhaps, an old 20th century model of diplomacy, nation states, because it seems the whole future of the world is at stake in so many different areas.
Well, precisely. And there's a whole array of new stakes that on the table that never have been there before. And really they threaten to unravel the natural basis, the ecological basis of human life. You just read some things in the New York Times, they just go by. In 30 years, maybe 1/3 of the species will go extinct. I mean, it's
astonishing.
This is staggering.
Yeah,
staggering.
Absolutely.
And so I think we have to, in a whole array of areas, we have to begin to move exactly. In a certain way, it's so obvious that you feel boring saying it. In a certain way, it's all simple beyond words. If we don't get together and solve our problems, we'll all die.
But usually those simple truths are the ones that are easiest to ignore. So you do have to talk about
I mean, ignore is certainly an apt word, but deny would be a strong word.
Right.
And sometimes it seems to me that what we're up to now in Iraq and around the world and so on is a gigantic sort of distraction, something to look at and do in order to avoid looking at the real life and death business that now lies before us in the nuclear area and in the global warming area and others.
Right. And I was curious, maybe my last question for you would be that, a lot of people, watch our show in different places in the world, and I think if they were watching this as a world citizen, as an activist, as a politician, whoever they might be, what would you recommend that just an individual do in terms of talking to their elected leaders, in terms of, trying to make this a more front and center issue, being nuclear proliferation? What would you say just as an individual that someone could do to try to, raise the level of its issue, for instance?
Well, if we're speaking, let's say we're speaking of a democracy, that machinery is still there, after all. We can't speak freely. I will not be put in jail this afternoon for saying the things that I've said to you,
That's right.
which I would be in another society, perhaps.
Right.
So the way I think of it is that we have a Rolls Royce that's parked in the garage, but we just don't get in it and drive it about.
Okay.
So really there has to be, and this is absolutely key, because all of this is going on in a sort of, people are concerned, and they're getting concerned, and I see signs of hope, but in a sort of glassy silence, we're in a sort of paralyzed, glassy silence. And there has to be some revival, rejuvenation of democracy itself, of the democratic will of peoples. We have to kind of somehow make use, number one, of the traditional venues that are open, voting and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But also reinvent the news media. I think you're doing that. And others are doing it. Reinvent the news media, but reinvent participation in our future. Somehow we've consigned it to other people.
Right.
We don't have the kind of activist spirit that we had just a few decades ago. And it must revive in some new way. Let it be on the internet. There was no internet before. It will take new forms.
That's right.
So you can't get to any of this if there isn't a kind of democratic reformation. Call it a revolution if you like.
Yeah, and are you optimistic? Do you see signs of that? But we have a long way to go.
I'm optimistic in the sense that if the will were developed and surely it can,
Right.
surely it's possible. But let me give you an example.
Yeah.
In 1979, who could have guessed that a movement like Solidarity in Poland, the independent trade union movement, and really much more would develop,
Right.
and that out of that really spreading throughout Eastern Europe and then eventually into Russia itself, that it would spell the end of the Soviet Union.
That's right.
So you see, when things catch fire democratically, when people do discover their capacity for action, things can move at a gallop.
Yeah.
And the obstacles in the way of solving the nuclear question, as I was mentioning before, are really not that great once the will were there, in my opinion.
Okay.
It's something that could actually rather readily be done, maybe over a period of 10 years. That was what Reagan and Gorbachev were talking about in 1986. Set a timetable of 10 years and then sit down and do it. I think it could be done.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.